me introduce a person that we all who have seen him before think very highly of. I want to read you an excerpt from Dr. Sabatino's bio. Frank Sabatino is a chiropractic physician who also holds a PhD in cell biology and neuroendocrinology from the Emory University School of Medicine. He has inspired thousands of people over the past 40 years through his work and lectures. And to that, I want to add, Frank Sabatino takes the complex and turns it into an entertaining, understandable education process for his audience. We are very lucky to have him with us tonight, and we hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Dr. Sabatino.
Good evening, everyone. I want to just send out my own personal welcome. I want to thank Ross and all the powers that be within the group there that have invited me. This is my second time participating with everyone, and I really relish the opportunity. And I'm really happy to be here. And what I thought tonight, which is very important because as we embark on what presentations look like in the age and time of Corona, which is where we are, this is novel for all of us. So I really appreciate that you've joined us. I know that there's certain difficulties within this, but we're going to try to have as much fun and flow as much as we can. I think everybody right now out there, including me and everybody in the public, has been dealing with the elephant in the room, which of course is the current epidemic of viral infection that we're dealing with. And there's been so much banter and so much talk about the immune system. And this, I believe, really is kind of a black box for a lot of people and not really understanding what it's about. So I thought a really good lecture series or a lecture topic would be looking at this immune system. What is it? How can we simplify what it does? And then understand the brilliant and dynamic process that it exerts to protect us. And not only that, how important various lifestyle factors are that you and I can control, that you and I participate in on a daily basis that can have an impact. Because I think many of us have been kind of wallowing in a lot of the fear that the media has spread. They've given us the idea of what we can do with sanitation and social distancing and so many things of that nature. But there hasn't been a lot of talk about the inherent power that each of us has to promote real support and real benefit in our own immune systems. So I want to start off with just discussing what is the immune system? What is it for? The immune system is a system, if you will, that is coming from cells provided by a number of organs and tissues in the body. And on this slide, you can see the spleen, you can see thymus gland, bone marrow. All of these tissues of the immune system, including the lymphatic system, are producing cells and materials that are going to provide a certain kind of protection, pure and simple. And what is the immune system? Well, it's a system that is designed to recognize everything that we are and everything that we're not, what people like to refer to as self and non-self. So for example, if you encounter a viral infection, as people are doing now, your immune system, your body has to make a spot decision. Is that infection, are those organisms me? And if they're not me, what can I do to protect me against what's not me? And so we know that the immune system has certain basic things that it has to deal with. And of course, you're going to see that there are a series of cells and tissues that the body generates for that protection. But understand that the body in its wisdom knows, for example, that, if you will, the bacteria and viruses that we encounter don't do very well in elevated temperature. So the body in its wisdom, under the input of any kind of infection, has evolved the ability, if you will, to deal with that information and raise body temperature. So what's a fundamental response of any body in the face of infection? Fever. So it's unfortunate that for decades, even for centuries, physicians did everything they could to eliminate fevers. They would medicate fevers out of existence. And back in the old days, even moderate fevers when I was a child in the 50s and 60s would be treated with all kinds of forms of prescription or non-prescription drugs like aspirin and Tylenol and ibuprofen, things that we have now, when in fact, And in the old days, back in the 50s, they used to like to combine a little religion and medicine and would give you St. Joseph's aspirin. I don't know if anybody remembers that far back. If you want to always make some medication benevolent, just put a saint's name on it. That usually works for most people. But the bottom line is, fever is a very natural part of the body's defense system. Now, on the other side of that, if we have any tissue injury, if you were to cut your arm or be in an accident and have some damage to the body also has to be able to heal that damage. It has to be able to clean up dead cells in the area. It has to bring blood into that area to create a kind of defense process. And it has to create a process of inflammation. So fever and inflammation are natural and healthy parts of a really good functioning immune system. But I think everybody out there can appreciate that if that fever went unchecked or that inflammatory process went uncontrolled, both of those actions would outlive their usefulness. And in fact, they possibly could put that person at greater risk. So understand that the immune system is a system that is designed to create action, first of all, reaction, action, and then create activities and functions that are in our best interest, even when we think they are symptoms that we need to kind of bypass. They are working for our benefit. But that immune system has to be able to control all of those processes. So today we're going to talk about factors, including lifestyle factors, that affect that level of control. And understand that the immune system or the immune response is broken down into two parts that we're going to discuss tonight. The first is what we call innate immunity, which you see on the top there on the slide. And that, of course, means it's inborn. So this is not something that is happening after we're exposed to something. This is something that we come into this world fully equipped to handle. And if you think about it, it's the first line of defense against invaders and injury. And when you look at how that's broken down, you have what's called in innate immunity, first of all, barrier protection. So when you're exposed to anything, a bacteria, a virus, understand that the body has natural barriers that allow it to resist that invasion. So if you think about it, we have skin, we have the mucous lining of the lung tissue and the gastrointestinal tract, your stomach and your intestine, and the urinary tract. And then, of course, we even have stomach acid, and we have lysozyme, which is a little acid in the mucous tissue, in the liquid and the tears of the eyes. So we have natural barriers so that when we encounter a bacteria or a virus, we already have a kind of barrier system, which is our first line of defense. And understand something. We're being exposed to bacteria and viruses every day. Coronavirus is not some new process that occurred. We're constantly being inundated with a wide range of bacteria and viruses, but we're not sick most of the time. So the barriers are your first line of protection. Then we go to another line of protection, which is what we call cell protection. And here we have what are called white blood cells. And on the slide, you can see the cast of characters that are involved in this process. And you don't need to get lost in all the terminology associated with it, but just understand that we have a population of cells that are produced in our bone marrow and in the spleen and in the thymus gland, that little picture of the immune system that I drew up, and in the lymphatic system, where we're releasing white blood cells. And if any of you have ever done blood work and had a blood test done, you know that they measure the number of your white blood cells. Well, these white blood cells are called leukocytes, white cells, and they are involved in the first line of protection. So if you have an invader that comes in, it's a very fast response. It's non-specific. They're not looking at anything specific about this invasion. They just know it's something foreign to the body. And they know that because every cell and every organism in the world, and including in the body, has a kind of a name tag that exists in the membrane of that cell. It's actually a protein complex that literally the body recognizes what cells are part of its membership and what are not. And if it sees that lining of that invader and it doesn't have the name tag that it really recognizes or has come to know, it will see that as a foreign intrusion into the population of cells, into the community of cells that the body represents. So white blood cells are the first line of protection. and they will literally go to an area of damage. And you have, for example, mast cells, one of the white blood cells. That mast cell will release a compound called histamine. And some of you may be aware of histamine with simple allergic reactions. Well, histamine causes blood vessels to dilate so blood can flood into an area. So if you cut your arm, you know that that blood is going to start flowing into that tissue. It's going to start releasing chemicals, what we call cytokines and other things, and we'll talk about these. They're like protein-like compounds that are going to start to do the cleaning up process. And actually, as the healing process ensues, some of those white blood cells, after they do their job, will die, and that will be seen as pus or something that can kind of ooze from that area of injury or that cut. And all that is are white blood cells that have done their job. They've tried to engulf, they've tried to eat any local invaders, bacteria, viruses in the area, and they've set in motion this healing. So the neutrophils come as the first line of defense. Mast cells release chemicals like histamine that cause blood to gush. Then you've got cells like macrophages. These are the big scavengers. They come in and they engulf and they eat foreign invaders. So if there's a virus or a bacteria that it doesn't recognize as a normal part of the body, it will digest and eat that cell. It will literally engulf it. And when it engulfs it and takes it in, it releases enzymes that will now digest that bacteria and digest that foreign invader. So think about the brilliance and the wisdom of this. And then we have a class of cells you see under here that are called dendrite cells. Because think about this, these, all of these invaders, these things that come into the body, they all have their own little signature, their own little name tag that is designed as structures on the surface of these invaders, things like bacteria and viruses. And these little protein badges or these little markers on these cells are what we call antigens. And when the body recognizes these antigens as foreign, these dendrite cells will literally take those antigens from a foreign invader and they will hand it off to a more sophisticated part of our immune system that we're going to come into discussing in just a second. But there's this ongoing dance of recognition, addressing change, bringing in, flooding the area, engulfing these foreign invaders, digesting them, eliminating them, and taking from them information that it literally can pass on and memorize in that immune system so that in a future time, it can already mount a response because it has now already recognized this invader. So these white blood cells play a major role in cleanup and healing. And there is also a complement system. And this is that when we have an invasion of bacteria and viruses, not only do we have all these wonderful dynamic cells in the bloodstream, these white blood cells, but we have a series of proteins that literally release markers that are called cytokines. Now that's a $5 word that just relates to chemicals that the body produces that tells it where to create the inflammatory process. Where is the damage? So these proteins will create an area, they'll run to an area and they will signal that this is where the body needs to address its attention. Think about the wisdom of this system, that on this very innate level, this is the lowest level of control, that you have this ability to recognize, to release proteins and cells that will mark the area, attract white blood cells to it, so they can engulf invaders and clean up tissue damage. And if you put it all together, there's another part of immunity, and we call this acquired or adaptive immunity. This is the part of the immune system that is not innate. It is something that is responding to what we experience as our lives progress, so that the body is now not only non-specifically addressing invasion and damage, but now it's going to create another level of control, a remarkable level, where now it will begin to recognize foreign invaders with another class of cells that can cause them, that can create and eliminate them, eliminate viruses, get rid of damaged cells, but also create a memory that can be put into the hard drive of that immune system so that anytime we encounter that organism again in the future, we already are primed to protect ourselves against it. So in the adaptive immunity, we have what are called T and B cells, And this is a more delayed response. And there's two parts to this. One is called cellular immunity, meaning that if you look on the top right, you'll see it says cell-mediated immune response. And you see a cell called the macrophage. It's ingesting an infected cell. So the macrophage will take it in. And then there will be a passing of information, the antigens, that special little markers on that infected cell and virus will be handed off to another T cell, which are made in the thymus. That's why they're called T cells. And that T cell will now have that antigen, have that unique identity, that identifying signature of the virus, and it will program a series of cells, other T cells, mainly helper T cells and killer T cells, that will get rid of the damaged cells that have been infected and will also now get rid of whatever virus and bacteria they can find that are in those infected cells. So this is a direct destruction of infected cells. They're not really getting rid of the virus and bacteria, but get this, when a cell gets infected, it changes the protein badge, the signature in the membrane of that cell. So the body no longer recognizes that as part of its own. It now knows that it's kind of a rogue cell. It's a damaged cell. So that could be an infected cell. That can even be a cell that turns into cancer. I think everybody in the audience probably appreciates that every second of every day, cancer cells are being generated. But our immune system in the cellular immunity is doing all of this surveillance to really get in, identifying these rogue cells and literally destroying them. So in the innate response, you have what are called natural killer cells that will kill infected cells. And in cellular immunity, the next level of adaptation, you have what are called killer T cells and helper T cells. And then tying that together, you have humoral immunity, where you have another cell called a B cell that will now literally make antibodies, special proteins, that will protect you against the actual organism itself. So when we adapt, there's a part of the immune system that kills damaged cells. These are what we call cellular immunity. But then there's another part of the immune system that programs the body's ability to recognize the organism, and so that in the future, it will be able to protect you if you're exposed to that again. So these all work together, because when this macrophage on the top here hands off that information about the virus, it will program T cells to activate B cells, and you'll get both things happening at once. You'll have damaged cells being eliminated, but you'll have these protein antibodies being produced that will now circulate in your body, that will program you for being able to protect yourself in a future time of need. So think about this layer, these levels of protection. You've got an innate initial response that helps you non-specifically, but if that gets overwhelming and that infection goes on, the body wants to do something more. It wants to create a bigger response to get rid of that damage and that threat, but it also wants to protect you against the future threat. So think about this incredible layer, these layers of incredible wisdom that the body manifests in encountering anything in the environment. And on the left, where it says humoral immunity, there's an opportunity for these antibodies to completely blanket. And you see on the bottom there, you see an antigen which looks like a worm, and you see that lymphocyte with those little spokes that look like Ys sticking out. They're recognizing the antigens, the special little proteins and structures on that bacteria or virus, and they're creating an exact antibody to match it so it can attach to it and prevent it from entering your cells. And I'll show you a picture of that. But the beautiful thing of this is, not only do we want to be able to resist threat, not only do we want to be able to handle tissue damage, but we want to have the sophistication to be able to remember what we did. And in the immune system, you're creating T and B memory cells that literally are like a new software that goes into the hard drive of that immune system and has that opportunity now in a future time of attack to be able to do that. That's why you're seeing out, you've all seen this on the news now, where they're talking about measuring blood tests and looking at antibodies that people have produced to the coronavirus. Because they know that if people produce antibodies, the next wave of infection, if it were to occur, for people that already have produced these antibodies, they will have a certain degree of protection because the body has already, in a sense, handled that invasion and now it can move on, okay? Now, so this is an overview of all of it. You see an antigen on your left in one. It's presenting to some antigen-presenting cell, which now goes to a helper T cell. It activates T cells, B cells. Antibodies are produced. So you have two arrows, if you'll notice. One arrow is going toward antibody production, and then there's an arrow going toward activating T cells that will get rid of just damaged cells. So understand, we're getting rid of damage. We're recognizing viruses and bacteria. We're creating chemicals that will attach to them and give us a memory of what we did. And now in the future, we have the ability to protect ourselves when we are exposed to this challenger again. It's just a remarkable thing. And I know it sounds a little complicated, but the bottom line is just recognize that all we're looking at is a system that has multiple layers of control that are involved with protecting us and remembering what it did so it can protect us even better in the future. Now, this is what a typical virus kind of looks like. And you'll notice this is an actual electron microscopic picture of a virus. And you see that it has a capsid or a little thing on the top that looks like almost like a barrel. In that barrel, you see some purple genetic material. It's got a stem and it's got legs that look like spider legs that are attaching. And those are the tails of the virus. And what a virus does is it attaches to a cell and literally injects the genetic material through the cell membrane, through the membrane of that cell. And that genetic material will go into your cell. It will incorporate in your own genetic material and use your own gene pool, your own genetic machinery to produce it. And as your genetics, as your cells are dividing and replicating, that DNA or that RNA, that nucleic acid that the virus contained is now being promoted and produced by your own cells. That's what makes viruses kind of tricky, because they're not really living or dead. They don't reproduce on their own. They require a host to be able to take up what they're giving. They're injecting this genetic material. So there's two things that have to happen. That virus has to be able to penetrate the cells, and then it has to be able to penetrate the genetic material and hijack it, literally hijacks our own genetic machinery to produce itself. And if enough of those viruses are produced, it literally blows that cell apart and damages that cell. But as we've said, we've got white blood cells and T cells that will recognize that, and they will come in and eat those cells up, those damaged, infected cells, so that the virus doesn't spread through the system. And we call that, when the virus builds up, we call it viral load. And in fact, anybody that's ever had a viral infection can go in and do a blood test, and they will measure viral load. Now, as a specific virus, let's talk about the elephant in the room. We know we've been dealing with corona, and this is a picture of the coronavirus. Many of you have probably seen it. Those red things that are attached to that ball are the things that we're calling the antigens. They're unique structures that this organism has that our immune system can come and recognize, because it's not something that's part of us. So it sees that as foreign. It can recognize that, and the body, the B cells of your adaptive immune system, can make antibodies against that. As it turns out, there are about 7 of these coronaviruses that we know of. 4 do nothing more than create common cold symptoms. That's why it's a little tricky with some of the testing that's being done now, because if you've ever had colds and normal colds and flus, it's possible that you can have coronavirus antibodies from those earlier exposures. But there are 3 of these coronaviruses that have been linked with severe respiratory conditions. Going back to 2002, you have SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, you have MERS, and you have COVID-19, which is the current one. Those are the names of the diseases. The virus for SARS was called SARS-CoV because it was SARS coronavirus, and now COVID-19 is just SARS-CoV-2. It's a second version of a coronavirus that's linked with respiratory conditions. The interesting thing about this virus is that it is basically derived from bats. It's very common in bats, and then usually it will move into an intermediate animal host. So for example, with SARS, there were civets, which is a cat-like animal. With COVID-19, it was an animal called a pangolin. which unfortunately is one of the most trafficked and abused animals in the world. And so it made that jump. And the interesting thing is, once it moves from the intermediate animal host, it can now spread to humans. And that spread to humans is what's called zoonotic, Z-O-O, as you see on the slide there, N-O-T-I-C, just means that it spreads from animal to man. And I have to tell you that one of the big issues of this spread is really directly related to our unbelievable dependence on animal food production. Because we know that the crowded factory farms that are really operating in many parts of the world, including our own, have such deplorable crowded conditions that the transmission of viruses and bacteria from animal to animal are a very real and constant problem. And then in markets in Asia and places of that nature, you had markets that were wet, constantly wet and dripping with the blood and feces and urine of animals that are stacked in these markets and slaughtered, with all of these fluids and juices just squirting onto people that are working them, people that are buying them, people that are eating them, and also transmitted from animal to animal. And the truth of the matter is, you've got to understand that without the dependence on animal food production, there wouldn't be any kind of coronavirus spreading into human populations, or it would be a very small occurrence. So you have to understand that our current pandemics and even future ones are going to be something that is absolutely ensured the more we depend on animal food production, which is another reason why moving into whole food plant-based is such an important process. Because when you're eating plant-based, you have a very low risk of viral infection, because so many of these are related to this abusive situation with animals, and we need to really change that. Now, to look at the coronavirus, if you look at it with its little spokes, imagine that gray area on top being a cell of the lungs. And you see how that coronavirus is attaching to it. And when it does, it can penetrate that cell, get involved inside that lung tissue, and start overproducing itself and replicating itself, causing tissue damage. And as you know, that's been the big concern with this virus, the acute respiratory problems that show up, especially in the elder population, and especially with people with other morbid conditions like high blood pressure, hypertension, so on and so forth. Now you'll notice on the body, when the B cells come, they produce this antibody, that's that blue thing that looks like the letter Y, and it has a little binding site at its end, so that the antigen on the coronavirus now attaches to it. And when that coronavirus would now try to attach to your lung cells, that antibody would block it from attaching. So that's how your body would protect you against future corona infection. So it has to recognize that virus. It signals that adaptive immune response where those B cells are producing antibodies. The antibodies attach to the virus and now give you some degree of protection. Now, we're going to break this down in terms of what helps us. Now getting the lay of the land with that immune response and a little picture of how viruses look and how they work. I'm going to focus this talk on three pieces that are absolutely within your personal control for remarkably enhancing your ability to support the protective effects and benefits of your own immune system. And that's going to be broken down into nutrition, exercise and activity, and the ways that we handle stress. And those three areas are incredible, what I call epi-immune phenomena. There are things from the outside. There are things that we do routinely that will give you tremendous benefit. So now you see here, I got a couple of pictures of all those goodies that are so much a part of the American diet. And we can make the case, and we have made the case, that when you look at the problems of nutrition, in countries like the United States, it's not so much the deficiencies of nutrition that really become the problem, but the excesses. And those excesses come in three flavors: animal protein, processed fats and oils, and then of course refined sugar. And these are found, as you see, in a lot of these fried and processed junk foods that we see here. And as it turns out, those foods are programming a process of ongoing inflammation and irritation that is a foundation in the body that compromises it in the face of immune support. Understand this: that when a virus or a bacteria comes into your body, one of the things that happens is, as we mentioned, is that your protective cells, your white blood cells, are releasing the class of chemicals called cytokines that create an inflammatory process. So inflammation is normal and it's a normal, healthy process. But if you already are maintaining a very high level of inflammation, if you now have to add to that the inflammation process of the immune system, it may so exaggerate that inflammatory outcome that may actually cause more tissue damage than it's worth. So we want to be able to create an inflammatory process, but we want to keep it at a very low level so that when we really need it, we don't have to worry about it being exaggerated. But when we eat these foods, there are certain things that happen. Number one, you got what are called heterocyclic amines. The creatine in meat, these acidic products, they create inflammatory change. They create what we call metabolic acidosis. We know that when you're eating more animal and dairy products and processed fats and refined foods, you're getting not only more saturated fat into the system, but you're getting more trans fats, or if you will, modified, altered fats. Remember this. Every cell and tissue or chemical in your body has a certain structure, just like the chairs in your house or the house itself. And I think you can all appreciate that the structure of those things actually dictates how they function. So in biology, we talk about structure dictating function. If I have a four-legged chair and I take one of the legs off, that structure will no longer be a functional chair. Well, in the human body, all of the chemicals, including fat, have a certain architectural arrangement. They have a three-dimensional orientation in space. And all the membranes of your cells that allow things to enter and allow, like food, and allow waste to leave, all have a certain architecture that are in the membrane of those cells. That membrane's kind of like a barrier, like a fence around your house. That food has to enter, garbage has to be taken out. So the fat in those membranes are so important for how things are able to glide and slide and move in and out of those cells. When you eat fried foods or you subject fats and oils to high heat and processing, you literally alter the fat, you transform that fat into a different structure. And now when the body tries to use that fat to put it into the fences of your cells to allow things to move in and out, that fat will no longer function in a nice liquidy functional way. It'll be more lard-like. So we know that when you're eating more refined and fried foods and you're getting more trans fats, you're now creating a situation in your cells where they will not function like normal cells. And in fact, the more trans fats you eat, the more inflammation you create, and the more you allow things to enter cells that normally the cell would block, and you block things that it normally would allow to enter. So we know that when you're eating more refined and processed food, and these transformed, changed fats become a bigger part of what's circulating in your body, those cells that now put those trans fats into their fences, into their membranes, will now be more prone to bacterial and viral infection. And I want you to think about that. They will now allow viruses to enter more successfully. If you recall, in our picture of the virus, it had to attach to a cell and then it had to penetrate that cell. When you have more trans fats, they can penetrate more successfully and they will exaggerate the inflammatory process in the body. Saturated fat, which is fats that we see that are solid at room temperature, like butter and cheese and all of that, we know are going to also slow down the movement of blood vessels in your blood vessels, cut down the oxygen that your tissues can have. They will also cause a thickening, a stiffening of your blood vessel wall. So nitrous oxide that the body produces that allows blood vessels to dilate and get blood into your tissues will now be constricted. And it begins that process of blockage and interfering with blood and oxygen supply. And that will cause oxidation, breakdown, irritation, and inflammation. So when you're eating these animal products, these alterations in fat and these concentrations of saturated and trans fats are so important to support the overall inflammatory process of the body and the body's ability to really resist the penetration of viruses and bacteria. We have oxidized cholesterol. You know, when we talk about cholesterol, cholesterol by itself is not a problem per se, but when it is changed into what we call a free radical, meaning that its chemistry has been altered so that it has what we call unpaired electrons on some of the oxygen components of the molecule. Don't worry about the chemistry of that. Just understand that when cholesterol is oxidized, it's more prone to cause damage in blood vessel walls. So heart disease and plaque formation in blood vessels will occur not just because of the increase of cholesterol, but when cholesterol is oxidized and converted into more of a free radical form. And so what we find is that anything that gets rid of free radicals, which are called oxidants, are called antioxidants. And as it turns out, the plant-based foods that we're going to recommend have the greatest amount of those. So when you're eating in a plant-based manner, you don't get that saturated fat. You're not eating processed foods. You don't get those trans fats. You have a lower cholesterol level because cholesterol is found primarily in the protein of animal products. And you're not going to have that, and you're not going to have it oxidized as much. So you can see how the plant-based approach is so profound for reducing the risk of heart disease and vascular damage that cuts off oxygen supply to the heart, the brain, and whatever. Oxidized cholesterol is a very big factor in the formation and progression of Alzheimer's disease. And I'd be happy to entertain a question about any of that later. Then you have this sialic acid compound called NOI-G5C, only found in red meat and animal products. It is something that promotes tumor growth and inflammation. We see something called TMAO, again, with the input of these dietary excesses. TMAO is something called trimethylamine oxide. Understand this. When we eat food normally, if you're eating a lot of red meat or you're eating poultry and you're eating eggs and you're eating things of that nature, there is a product that you have a high level of something called carnitine and choline that will come in with those foods. In the body, the bacteria in your body, and we're going to talk about the role of the gut bacteria in relationship to immunity. The gut bacteria in your body will take that carnitine and convert it into something called trimethylamine. And you have enzymes in your liver that will convert it into TMAO, trimethylamine oxide. The important point is TMAO is one of the primary powerful causes of vascular blockage, heart disease, all-cause mortality from heart disease. And what's one of the biggest risk factors right now for people being hospitalized with corona? Heart disease. So blockage of blood vessels, heart disease. TMAO is produced by the bacteria in our own body, the normal bacteria, but in response to the large intake of animal and dairy products. And by the way, there's a high concentration of TMAO in fish. Those of you that really feel that fish is a better option and a better way out. The body doesn't even need to convert it when you eat fish. It already has a high level of that. But understand that all-cause mortality from heart disease, vascular blockage disease, atherosclerosis, all of that is promoted remarkably by TMAO. Heme iron is the form of iron that is only found in the flesh and tissues of animal bodies. It is a major pro-oxidant level, a pro-inflammatory component. And if you're eating animal products, again, you're ratcheting up that animal-based stuff, and of course with fats and oils and sugars. And finally, the combination of protein, processed oil, and sugar create something that are called advanced glycation end products. They're called age for a reason, because we know that when you cook these foods under high heat, there's a chemical process that is converting the way sugar, fat, and protein interact and entwine themselves into these compounds that are called glycation end products. They're chemicals that are linked with premature aging, inflammation, and change throughout the entire body, brain, heart, and the like. And make no mistake, they have been really investigated with tremendous amount of research for their impact on aging. And we know that the more AGEs that we consume, the more premature aging that we experience. And this is very intriguing because we can actually measure the AGE content of different foods. And the interesting thing is some literature, some of the data suggests that if you're taking more than 15,000 units of AGEs a day, it is a major inflammatory provoker and a major provoker of premature aging. 15,000 units. Get this. If you look at 3 to 4 ounces of any plant food, vegetables, plants, and the like, and even including bread, grains, legumes like nuts and seeds and so on, and legumes like beans and things, you're going to find that the AGE content is somewhere between like 100 to 400 units in a 3 to 4 ounce portion. If you look at cheese and dairy products, it goes between 10 and 25,000 units. And anything with higher fat content will have higher AGE content. So if you look at olives or avocado, they have a higher fat content. So they have an AGE content for about a 3 to 4 ounce portion of about 1 to 2,000 units. Remember, we said we want to be under 15,000. So even if you're eating those foods in moderation, you're not doing too badly. But the bottom line is, if you take olives, which have about 2,000 units of AGE, and you process it into the cleanest olive oil you can make, the AGE content goes up 6 times. It's about 10 to 12,000, which is the reason why, even though it looks like oils are a good thing to do, we know that we don't recommend oil in bottled form. We recommend oil only in the whole foods in which it exists. Remember, there is no animal in nature that isolates the pure fat from its food chain, puts it in big bottles of liquid fat, and then pours it and douses it on everything. The fact of the matter is, and the worst AGE food, anybody that's eating it out there, I hope you're not, is our good friend bacon. And you know they're putting bacon everywhere. Remember this, celery, cucumber, grains, and all of that have AGE content 100 to about 400 units for a 3 to 4 ounce portion, 1 to 400. A 3 to 4 ounce portion of bacon is over 90,000 units of AGE. Yes, you heard that correct. 90,000 units. Remember, 15,000 is kind of the cutoff for premature aging and inflammation. So you want to drive inflammation in the human body and aging, just load up on bacon. So there's no place for these excesses, and that's why we really want to go. Now, we also know that of the fats that we eat, there are building blocks of fats that we call fatty acids. They are just the little building blocks that make up fats. As it turns out, 2 of these are what we call essential, meaning that we can't make them, and they have to come in the diet that we need, and we need them. But they play a major role in balancing the function of the immune system. If you look on the left of the slide, you see omega-6, and you have linoleic acid, which really is contained in large amounts in a lot of the polyunsaturated oils, like corn, cottonseed, sunflower. Again, oils that show up in a lot of processed foods. Now, there's small amounts of it in grain, in certain nuts, so the body will have it, and you'll notice that it produces in this pathway a class of compounds called prostaglandins, which you see in red, and it actually is a pathway that increases inflammation. Now, if you recall back to the beginning of this talk, we made the point that if you have tissue damage in the body, or if you have an invader, the inflammatory process was part of our ability to protect us. So we need some degree of inflammation. So we need this pathway. But understand that this pathway is coming from these polyunsaturated oils and these animal and dairy products, especially beef, pork, chicken, and the like. So the bottom line is, if you were eating very modest amounts of those foods, you would produce very modest amounts of these pro-inflammatory prostaglandins, the ones that increase inflammation. The problem is, so much of the diet of the American public is concentrated with these foods. The regular person, the average person in America is taking as much as 80% of their protein from animal products. So what we've done is we've exaggerated this pathway and have exaggerated the production and the outcome of inflammation. Remember, the body balances inflammation with prostaglandins. It's a $5 word for chemicals that are produced from these essential fatty acids. As it turns out, when you're eating a lot of processed oils and animal products, you're over-exaggerating inflammation. Again, you're compromising the immune system. On the other side of the equation, you see omega-3, And these are the alpha-linolenic acid, and that's contained a lot in things like walnuts and whole grains and deep greens, and especially seeds like chia, hemp, and flax. As it turns out, in this pathway, you're producing anti-inflammation. It's a kind of an anti-inflammatory pathway. So these two sides of this picture are balancing how the body generates inflammation. But because our diets have been so loaded with processed oils and animal products, we have exaggerated the inflammatory side of the equation. So we're recommending that as you eat in more of a plant-based manner, you're building in this remarkable protection by providing an anti-inflammatory component, keeping the inflammation levels of the body nice and low, and not provoking that immune system response that will be exaggerated in the face of infection. So we recommend, again, coming back and eating in a very kind of simplistic manner, a lot more whole grains, nuts like walnuts in small amounts, seeds like chia, hemp, and flaxseed, building in that omega-3 pathway. So what we're recommending very simply in a plant-based manner is to understand that when you eat this way, you're creating an environment that is so supportive for the immune system, reducing oxidative stress, oxidants and free radicals, reducing inflammation and acidosis, the acid changes, reducing irritation, reducing the comorbid conditions of heart disease, lowering the outcome of weight and obesity, and we're going to come and talk about that in just a little bit. Reducing, again, any inflammatory component that could aggravate your lung tissue, so that if you did get exposed to a virus and you do get some inflammatory change in the lung, it's not going to be an exaggerated inflammatory process that starts causing damage to lung cells, starts to infiltrate the lungs with fluid and everything that makes it impossible to breathe. We could get rid of ventilators. We could get rid of these emergency situations that are happening. So we want to just really recommend putting a rainbow on your plate. And I love this little rainbow of all our wonderful things. And understand that whole food, plant-only diets have 50 to 60 times more antioxidants than any other eating plan. And this ties into the final slide on this little piece of nutrition. And this is just a study of dietary patterns that are ongoing right now and have been ongoing for quite some time. The first is called the Adventist Health Study with the Seventh-day Adventists in North America, more than 96,000 people, still ongoing. The EPIC Oxford study in England with over 65,000 people began in 1993, still ongoing. And the Tzu Chi Health Study in Taiwan, Buddhists in Taiwan, over 6,000 people, began in 2007 and still ongoing. What's the important point? The people that are eating in plant-based manners in these studies, these health die at about half the death rate of the general population in these regions. Understand what viral and bacterial infection, that it's not only what's happening with the virus and bacteria that's important, but what are the underlying, what we call comorbid conditions? We've seen this clearly with this corona situation. If you're an elder person, that's one risk factor. But if you're an elder person that's obese or has hypertension, high blood pressure, or heart disease, or cancer, you are much more likely to be involved in an emergency situation and maybe even death. So mortality goes up with those comorbid conditions, and it's intriguing that every one of those comorbid conditions is absolutely not only prevented by eating in a plant-based manner, but it's reversed by eating in a plant-based manner. So we eliminate the morbidity, we decrease the mortality, as these studies have clearly shown, and by eating in a whole food plant-based manner, we get rid of all of those confounding factors that make this immune system response so much more compromised. Now, when we talk about the eating in a plant-based manner, understand that we're not only eating for ourselves. We have a lot of buddies that live within us. We know, for example, that there are about 10 trillion cells in the human body, but about 100 trillion organisms, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, even viruses that live within us. And a good question would be, why would we have this population of stuff in the body that is 10 times more than the entire number of cells that we have? They have to be there for some particular reason. And as it turns out, they are. Because the bacteria that live commensally with us, in symbiosis with us, are producing vitamins, they're producing neurotransmitters, they're producing chemicals of support, and they're even protecting cells of the body against disease and even cancer. So we now know that when we are eating plant-based, that the diversity of plant food and the diversity of the gut microbiota, and gut microbiota, which I'm abbreviating as GM, just refers to the population of bacteria that live in your intestinal tract. About 2 pounds of your body weight is actually all of the bacteria and organisms that live in the gut. And as it turns out, these are essential for health in that body. We know that when you're eating a high fiber plant-based diet, there's more diversity of these organisms. And here's the kicker. There's really no set normal for this environment because it's so changeable and it's really programmed from the moments we are in, from the time even before we're born and how we're born. We know that when babies are born and when they nurse, that already begins this process of change. And there's more diversity for babies that are born vaginally and that are breastfed. So it lays the groundwork early on for a healthier gut. But we know that when you're eating a high fiber plant-based diet, we have more of a diversity of the gut. And we're coming to find out that that diversity is critical for better health outcome, for better health options. And the organisms that are supported when we eat high fiber plant-based are organisms that produce small little chains of fatty acids that we call short chain fatty acids. You see that abbreviated as SCFA. You're going to see that those fats create the healthy gut lining that protects you against infection and damage and inflammation. But understand that diversity is very, very critical. And understand that fiber, many fibers, we are incapable of digesting. And since plant foods have the highest fiber content, a good question would be, how can I say that eating plant foods are the best foods for us if the fiber content of them is something we can't digest? Well, as it turns out, when you're eating plant-based foods, you're not only feeding yourself the best diet, but you're feeding that population of bacteria that we rely on, that we need, their best diet. We find that certain of the bacteria like Ruminococcus, Prevotella, that are supported by plant-based foods are remarkably anti-inflammatory. Think about that. They create that anti-inflammatory environment that is tied into really supporting and enhancing our own immune support. They will also decrease the stiffness of blood vessels, increasing or decreasing the risk of heart disease. And we also know that animal protein and saturated fats decrease diversity, giving us less opportunity for benefit. They create a number of bacteria that are actually pro-inflammatory. They increase inflammation. So when we look at this in the bigger picture, we find that the wide variety of fruits and vegetables like grains, legumes, potatoes, onions, nuts, seeds, they feed this gut microbiota, the gut stuff that's in our body. They feed this fiber. The gut microbiota will ferment this fiber, producing these little fats that will feed your gut lining, creating this beautiful plush mucus lining that is protecting things from entering the body, toxins and poisons and chemicals. We find that the animal protein and saturated fat will increase the generation of pathogens, more dangerous bacteria in the gut that cause an increase in the release of those chemicals, those markers, those little buoys that we call cytokines that direct and regulate the immune and inflammatory response. They bring those white blood cells, they bring those T cells to an area to clean up all of that damage. But when you're eating animal proteins and fats, you're creating bacteria, you're fostering bacteria and organisms in your gut that are increasing that inflammation and immune problem. We also know that the mono and polyunsaturated fats of the vegan diet enhance what are called the lactic acid bacteria in your large bowel, the colon, things like bifidobacteria, which shows up in some of the things like yogurts and things that people would eat, or shows up in probiotics. These lactic acid bacteria are just what it says. They create a more acidic environment in your large bowel, the colon, by releasing the compound called butyrate, which is a fatty acid. Acid that's on fatty acid means it's creating a little bit of a lower pH. And we now find that that will protect the large bowel. It actually provides a protective effect because a lot of the organisms in your gut that are dangerous, E. coli and things that produce poisons in the gut, cannot function in a low pH. So when you're eating all of these plant-based foods, it's creating a local acidic environment in the large bowel that does not allow the dangerous organisms to flourish, and it reduces the load on that immune system. We also know that there's a major part of foods, what we call plant-based nutrients called polyphenols. And these are things like the isoflavones in soy, the things found in turmeric, the tannins that are found in berries and pomegranates, walnuts, almonds, all those plant-based foods. That class of compounds are called polyphenols. We now know that the gut flora, when it's fed the proper fiber and plants, will transform those polyphenols that in a way that will activate T cells, B cells, lymphocytes. It actually literally activates in the most powerful way both the innate and adaptive immune system and reduces inflammation, and it is antiviral. It gives us the best viral protection. So think about this. When you're eating plant-based, you're getting all of that protection from those foods, but now you're enhancing and protecting all of the gut flora that we have and allowing it to transform chemicals in those plant-based foods that are going to support and enhance this immune system. It's such a remarkable and brilliant process that occurs, and it is antiviral. So again, when you've got people suffering with viral infection, they have got to move away from animal product consumption, away from refined and processed and fried and compromised food, and get into whole plant-based foods on the several levels of body protection and gut protection. Now, when we talked about this, we made the point that when these bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, on the right, on the top, you see a picture of cells, and you see things that look like little discs sitting on this little plush kind of cushiony thing, and then you see several cells underneath that. That's a picture of the large bowel, the colon. And those cells of the colon are held together by something called tight junctions. They're little proteins that lock those cells. Remember this, the large bowel is designed only to absorb very small chemicals, things like water and small electrolytes. All of the food that you're absorbing, the nutrients, is absorbed in your small intestine. So what the large bowel is trying to take back any fluid and electrolytes as that food passes through your intestinal tract to make feces when you go to the bathroom. So the large bowel is very, very tight. And the bacteria, the healthy bacteria that are being fed by the fiber in the plants we're eating, is producing those fatty acids that create that beautiful plush mucus lining that protects the bowel. But when we have factors like low fiber, refined foods, those bacteria are not being fed. When we have things like stress and we increase cortisol, cortisol will inflame the lining of that gut and damage and change those bacteria. When we're consuming alcohol, it will damage that lining and those bacteria. When we have antibiotics, I think you can appreciate that it's going to be damaging and killing off some of those very healthy bacteria. And this shows up to a tremendous degree in a lot of the fish farms and factory farms where antibiotic use is across the board over the top. And so in our food supply, it's being generated. By the time a child is 18 in the United States, he can go through as many as 10 to 20 rounds of antibiotics for any number of issues, and it's unconscionable. And then finally, when you're dealing with GMO plants like soy and corn, for example, and especially now that you have herbicides like glyphosate being sprayed on things like oats and wheat, these GMO plants were designed genetically by companies like Monsanto to be able to resist weed killers. So when they produced these plants, they decided that if they did that, they could spray more intensely to get rid of weeds and things around the growing population of these plants. And so what happens is it led to this explosion of these herbicides. And what happens is these GMO plants with these herbicides will also have a major effect of damaging that gut lining. Now, what happens? If you look on that picture on the right, you'll see that healthy picture of the gut. And when it is changed by all of those factors, you see that there's damage to that lining. And now those very tight junctions of the large bowel have now opened up. And you've created the condition that we call leaky gut. And now small protein molecules, byproducts, waste in the bowel, damaging bacteria can now seep through that opening, get into your bloodstream, and now the immune system will be remarkably activated. And you're creating inflammation and cytokines and an exaggerated immune response. So now imagine if you're trying to fight a bacterial or viral infection and you've got this going on in the gut, programming all of this remarkable exaggeration, you're going to put that body at risk. You're going to overstimulate that immune system. And even more importantly, what's going to happen now is you're going to have small little protein fragments and pieces of the things you've been eating seeping through a gut lining that was designed to block it. It wasn't designed to accept that. And if you're eating, for example, protein, flesh food, you're going to be eating protein in the cartilage and tendons and ligaments and the flesh of those animals. But many of those proteins are similar to the proteins in your own joints. So if you have a leaky gut and damage to the gut lining, and those proteins are seeping through, sneaking through, and your immune system is attacking those antigens, it's creating a response against those foreign proteins. What do you think it's going to do when it encounters proteins that are similar to those in your own joints? It's going to start damaging those. So this process is very much linked with the phenomenon of autoimmune disease. And you've heard of rheumatoid arthritis and even Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So a lot of these autoimmune diseases are following on the heels of the damage to this gut lining that is being dramatically produced by these lifestyle factors and choices, and especially by the fact that we're not eating the diversity of plant-based foods that help this gut. So understand this relationship of healthy gut lining and the integrity of the bacteria and organisms in your own body and how they are helping to regulate and involve themselves in this immune response. Now, as a unique element, I want to address something that I think is incredibly, incredibly important. And that is this issue of vitamin D. Because during this time when we were socially distancing and staying cloistered, and there was value, especially in doing that for some period of time, to protect people at risk, one of the things that was not being addressed is the remarkable importance of sunlight, sunshine, and vitamin D. Now, understand something, vitamin D is actually more than a vitamin in the human body. It's very much a hormone. It operates very hormonally in the human body. And in fact, vitamin D can turn on and regulate over 1,000 genes in the human body, which is about 5% of our entire gene pool. But when sun hits your skin, it activates a form of cholesterol in your skin to produce something called vitamin D3. That vitamin D3 will now be sent to your fat cells in your liver, because remember, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. It can be dissolved and stored in fat. It will go to fat cells in your liver. In your liver, it will be converted into something called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. That 25-hydroxyvitamin D will go into your bloodstream, will travel to your kidney, where the final activated form of vitamin D will be produced. So sun hits the skin, goes to the liver, is finally processed in the liver, goes out into the bones, goes out into the intestine, goes out into the kidney, goes out into the body at large. Now, when you do a blood test, and I recommend people to do this, you can measure 25-hydroxyvitamin D on any blood test. It's a routine test. And that'll tell you where your vitamin D levels are. But here's the important point for this discussion. Vitamin D, number one, balances the innate and adaptive immune response. So it has unique adjustment and attachment to the ongoing innate and adaptive immune response. We find that there are vitamin D receptors on both B and T cells and on antigen presenting cells. And we find now, why would these cells of the immune system have specific vitamin D receptors, things that can recognize and receive vitamin D? Because it has direct effects on being able to activate the powerful supportive cells of the immune system. So vitamin D gets right into the cells of that immune system. We find that immune cells will actually themselves, very much like the kidney, be able to synthesize the active form of vitamin D. Think about that. Not only do we have a liver and kidney system that can get this very important hormone into the body, but we now find that the cells themselves of the immune system are able to directly receive it, but even more than that, can directly create the final activated form of it to provide another level of support. So think about how important that sunshine is for direct effects on the ability of that immune system to function. We know that we find that there's increased defensive production, decreased infiltration at the barrier sites. So there's protection of that barrier effect, again, so even on all the barriers. We also know that it decreases, and this is very important, vitamin D has a direct effect on decreasing acute viral respiratory infection. Think about one of the biggest correlative factors of this problem right now with corona, people being subject to that severe acute respiratory problem. Here we're seeing, again, in this situation, the decrease in the acute viral respiratory infection. So a direct effect on that lung tissue. People at this time should have been able to be getting that sunlight exposure or some vitamin D supplementation. And finally, we find that it decreases the pro-inflammatory environment of the gut. Vitamin D has an impact on reducing that dysbiosis, that damage to the gut lining. So you've all heard of probiosis, probiotics. Dysbiosis is when it changes abnormally. And we saw how alcohol and all those lifestyle factors do that. Vitamin D reverses that. It decreases the risk of dysbiosis. Now it goes even a step further. We also find in the human body that there are a class of proteins that are called defense proteins. They have a direct and specific effect on reducing viral infection. So think about this. I mean, it just blows my mind to understand these layers of control that the body has. We talked about the innate immune system. We talked about the adaptive immune system and the cells that protect us. On top of that, we have a whole class of proteins called human defense proteins or host defense proteins that are very much attached to the mucous tissue around the barrier site. So the nose, the mouth, the lungs, the lining of the GI tract. And one of these is something called cathelicidin. And this cathelicidin is one of the most dominant of these host defense proteins. The intriguing piece is it is dramatically upregulated, increased, and enhanced by vitamin D, by a healthy gut flora that is fed proper fiber, and by the short-chain fatty acid butyrate that is produced when your bowel is getting the fiber that it needs. So this cathelicidin decreases the binding of viruses and it decreases infection. Remember we said to have viral infection, viruses had to attach to the cell. And what happens to this cathelicidin, these defense proteins, they bind to the virus so it can no longer effectively bind to the cell, so it can't cause infection. We find that these proteins also protect and stiffen the membrane of the cell, making it stiffer and less permeable, meaning things can't get through it as easily. So if you have a virus that's trying to attach to a cell that has to penetrate the cell, it can no longer get through that stiffer cell membrane. It's being protected. It's protecting you against the virus entering your cells, and there it decreases infection. This is very important. It creates cell stiffness and permeability, especially in lung tissue, which means it's so protective for the lungs for viral infection. And that's, of course, been a big issue with this coronavirus infection. So the cathelicidin produced from vitamin D and healthy nutritional plant-based foods are going to cause the lung tissue to be stiffer and not allow those viruses to enter as easy. It also binds to the virus and literally breaks down the membrane of the virus directly. So it impairs the virus before it even attaches. So it gets out as the virus is coming in when it's trying to attach. Not only does it block it from entering, it literally creates a situation where it's actually breaking the virus down so it can't even infect the cell. It reduces inflammatory cytokines, as you see here. There's less inflammation, which means that you're decreasing inflammation. And the combination of vitamin D3 and butyrate which is the short chain fatty acid that your bacteria are producing to protect the bowel, they work together to increase this defense protein. And interestingly enough, vitamin D even promotes the expression of genes that produce these proteins and genes that produce the junction that keeps your large bowel tight. So vitamin D is having this impact on the viral situation directly, but it's also enhancing this other level of defense proteins that are giving you unbelievable protection by preventing cell viruses to bind, preventing them to enter cells, and damaging them before they can even enter. Just a remarkable process. With vitamin D, we need to get about 10 to 15 minutes of soft sun exposure daily. And if that can be done walking or outside, of course, there's always been this fear about getting sun exposure, which is something we need some of it, but you only need about 10 to 15 minutes. If you're living in more northern climates where, this can't happen as easily, I like to measure 25 hydroxyvitamin D on every blood test because I could see it within a range of normal, and I like it to be about mid-range. But as a safe defense, I would recommend about 2,000 international units of vitamin D as a supplement. Vitamin D3 supplement daily, just about 2,000 international units. And it's a fat-soluble vitamin, all right? Now, there is a huge body of literature that suggests that ongoing regular physical activity has a huge impact on the immune response. That's what IR is here. So for example, moderate consistent activity, less than 60 minutes, and that can be walking, and usually at a rate where you're almost having a difficult time carrying on a conversation, what we call the lower level of heart rate, maximum heart rate, which is about 60 to 70%. But we find that this moderate activity will dramatically increase the innate and adaptive immune response. It increases the activity of natural killer cells, cytotoxic T cells, which are the CD8 cells, and B cells, which are producing antibodies. So it's actually enhancing the activity of all of those cells that get rid of damaged, infected cells, and also improving the function of cells that are producing antibodies against foreign invaders. Just think about that. And that's why even during this time of infection, it was so important and is so important for people to maintain that level of physical activity. And it also produces anti-inflammatory cytokines. It brings that level of inflammation down, again, keeping it moderate and consistent. But on the other hand, number two, as you see there, acute episodes of intense prolonged activity. This is, of course, much greater than 60 minutes and much higher exhausting intensity, actually have been shown to increase the risk of illness and to decrease some of those healthy cells of the immune system, and also to increase upper respiratory tract infections. That's what that URTI is, about 1 to 2 weeks after that activity. So while moderate, consistent exercise is so important, again, overdoing it, putting the body into this abuse of activity and overstimulating it that way may actually have some negative effects. Multiple trials and tests have shown that moderate exercise, as I mentioned there, dramatically decreases the incidence and duration of upper respiratory tract infections. You want to improve the integrity of the lung in these severe lung infection times with these viral infections. Activity is so critical and crucial to protect you. It's a remarkable protection. And finally, the activity will decrease free radicals, what we call reactive oxygen species. They will, again, decrease chronic inflammation and reduce the decrease free radicals. That's overstimulated exercise. Regular exercise will actually, decrease free radicals. It will reduce chronic inflammation, and it will help clear pathogens, meaning help the body get rid of bacteria and viruses. It increases also antioxidant enzymes, catalase, superoxide dismutase. These are the enzymes that the body uses naturally to get rid of free radicals, those things that cause inflammation, damage, and aging. So when we exercise, we're getting a production of chemicals, antioxidant enzymes, we're getting rid of viruses and bacteria, we're lowering the inflammatory process, and we're decreasing free radicals. So the activity is critical. And we also find that there is an aging process that goes on in the immune system that exercise will help modify and control. And this is not a small point. It shouldn't be any mystery that while the body is aging, all the systems of the body may be aging. But lifestyle factors of nutrition and activity and so on can really modify that aging process. So we know that regardless of your chronological age, your actual functional biological age can be much younger when you're entertaining healthier lifestyle options and choices. So the immune response is more dysfunctional with age, which means people, as they get older, can be more susceptible to infection and cancer and metabolic diseases. But that immune system can be remodeled and improved. It's not something that just has to happen with a steady decline. What we do in our lifestyle choices, especially with activity, can help to remodel that. And in these two studies, sedentary elderly women were compared to conditioned women who were very active, and they saw a tremendous increase in T cells and active cells of the immune system and a decrease in the illness rate. And with elderly runners who were trained over a number of years versus inactive elderly, we saw a remarkable increase in the very supportive T cell lymphocytes of the adaptive immune response. So when we look at habitual exercise, we're looking at the fact that it increases the proliferation of those T cells, those cells that mediate cell-mediated immunity, getting rid of infected cells in the body. It decreases exhausted age cells, so it reduces the number of cells that age in the body, reduces the aging of your immune system cells. It decreases the circulation of cytokines that increase inflammation. Remember, when you're increasing inflammation, you're exaggerating and stimulating this aggravated immune response, where it lowers the inflammatory responses to bacterial and viral infection, so that when you encounter an infection, bacterial, virally, it's going to create a nice, gentle, inflammatory response that will be in the body's best interest, not one that is completely exaggerated because you're already operating at such a high level of inflammation. We find that it will increase the activity of NK, that's natural killer cells. Those are those cells of your innate immune response that are doing surveillance all the time, recognizing already damaged cells so we can get rid of them. So if you have an infected cell, the infection changes that ID badge on the outside of that cell so that the body realizes now that it's a rogue cell. It no longer belongs in the body. And these killer cells will come along and just eat them up. It'll digest them, it'll break them down. It so happens that exercise habitually increases the number of those. Now, when we look at obesity, as you can see on the right, this is a big issue. And fat cells are not inert cells that just make us look less attractive. These are cells that are producing their own population of inflammatory chemicals. They're driving up the inflammatory response, which is why, if you look here, these are all of the different kinds of inflammatory cytokines, which now, because they're produced by fat cells, are called adipokines. They're from adipocytes, fat cells. You have interleukins, you have tumor necrosis factor, you have macrophage stimulating factor. These are chemicals that stimulate your cells of the immune system to become active, to create a fighting, exaggerated response. Now, we want that when we're being infected, but if we're not infected and we're generating that response, it's exaggerating and compromising that immune system. And to give you an idea, if you look at this, these two graphs, on the left, on the y-axis, you're seeing CRP and something called interleukin-6. These are two cytokines. These are two of those markers, those buoys that drive inflammation. And you'll notice that the large boxes are obese people with BMIs above 31, meaning that's the body mass index, which is measuring the relationship of your height and weight. And you'll notice that when people get more obese, those markers go up. So look at those boxes compared to the boxes in athletes and people doing regular physical activity. You can see that the markers are so much lower if you look at the right boxes compared to the left, so that in obesity, you're maintaining this exaggerated level of inflammation. And if you start adding inflammatory foods and trans fats and all the things we've talked about, you can see how it drives this remarkable compromise of the immune system. So the obesity impact on the immune response is going to be, number one, it creates a constant state of low-grade inflammation. It is characterized by inflammation, increased inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. It activates pro-inflammatory cells like macrophages and acute phase proteins like CRP, that's the cytokines, and again, reactive oxygen species, free radicals that cause damage. Studies have shown that as the BMI, that body mass index, goes up, it has the strongest effect on these cytokines, on these inflammatory producing chemicals. And understand that obesity drives down the availability of vitamin D. Remember, we said when the sunlight hits your skin, it converts the cholesterol in your skin to vitamin D. Part of that vitamin D goes into your fat cells. If you have a lot of fat tissue, a lot of fat cells, it's going to eat up that available vitamin D, so you won't have it in your blood to give you the protection against viral infection. So when you're getting fatter or you're putting on weight, you're decreasing the availability of vitamin D and you're reducing the production of defense proteins against infection. So obesity remarkably compromises us for infection on so many different levels. And that's the reason why obese people in this particular environment of the coronavirus were 6 times more likely to be hospitalized with complications of the virus than people who were not obese. But understand that that was with the body mass index above 28. Are defined as obesity. The average body mass index in the United States is 28 to 29. So we have an overall population that's already operating with a body mass index that's putting them in compromise for the negative morbid outcome with viral infection. And by just simple weight loss, and again, eating in a plant-based manner, provides the low calorie density, the high nutrient density that gives you the greatest opportunity to lose and regulate weight. Don't misunderstand this impact of obesity. And finally, when we talk about stress, there are unique relationships of how we handle and work with stress to impact our immune system. Now, when we talk about stress, this is kind of a nebulous term for many people. It's kind of a high-level abstraction. So it means many different things to many different people. The fact is, a certain amount of positive stress could be valuable for provoking performance. So if you think about athletes or somebody getting on a stage to act, a certain amount of stress may actually motivate better performance. But stress can also be the gnawing, nagging, bitching situations of day-to-day relationships, and it could also be catastrophic traumatic events. But I think most people, when they think about stress, they only think about it on a psychological and emotional level. So I want to share with you what I call the 3 T's of stress. And they are what we call trauma, toxins, and thought. If you have a physical trauma, a mechanical injury, that's a stress to the human body. If you have chemical toxins circulating in the body from anything like weed killers that we talked about, or poor foods or whatever, those are chemical, that's a chemical stress. And then finally, the psychological factors of thought, psychological interactions, relationships. So the 3 T's of stress all generate a stressful response. And understand that that stressful response that's generated is something that is preparing us to do one of 2 things in relationship to that stress. And that is either to fight it or run away from it, what we call the fight or flight response. But I think you can appreciate that if you're going to fight or run away from any situation that is threatening you, the only way you can do that is if you get your nervous and muscular system involved. So all of the actions of fight or flight are designed to get as much blood and oxygen into your muscles so that you can fight or run away. So under the stressful response of fight or flight, we have an increase in blood pressure. Blood pressure gets higher as the body tries to squeeze more blood into your muscles. We find that there's a decrease in digestive function because that's going to be our last concern when we're concerned about our life, getting our next gourmet meal. And we also find that there's going to be a change in our breathing process. If you think about it, if you were going to take long, slow, deep breaths in the face of stress, by the time you took 1 breath, you could be dead. So our breath becomes more rapid and shallow. And as it turns out, all of those physical changes are being generated by chemicals reduced and replaced and released by the glands of stress, which in this case is the adrenal gland. And you see on this graph, the control comes from the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then you see adrenal cortex. Coming out of that adrenal gland is the compound called cortisol, and also another compound called noradrenaline. And those compounds are released by those glands to create all of the symptoms of fight or flight, making sure your heart rate and your blood pressure and your digestive system and so on are being geared for the fight or flight. And they're also released to increase your attention and focus so you can focus on that event. As it turns out, however, that response is designed only for a very short term, because the fight or flight was designed for you to deal with that event in present time and then get on with your deal with that survival challenge and get on with your next event. The problem in modern times is we're no longer dealing with concrete tribes and animals, threats. We're now dealing with what we call paper tigers, more of the gnawing, nagging issues of ongoing relationships, the abstractions of human communication. So instead of getting focused on the present experience, we get often lost in the sorrows of the past, or we get worried about our insecure future. When in fact, the past already occurred, the future may or may not occur, and the only moment you really got is in that present moment. But when you are being distracted from that present time experience, you're driving a more chronic release of that fight or flight system. And as that cortisol level goes up, you'll find that that cortisol will now have an effect of suppressing your immune system. You see that negative little circle underneath where it says immune system. So your lymphocytes, your macrophages, your neutrophils, all of those cells that we talked about that are creating your immune response are being reduced and compromised in their function under chronic, delayed, ongoing stress. So the bottom line is that's why in many ways, stress management or stress control or stress help is very much focused on how can we create a more present time awareness so that we're not overdriving that stress axis, the stress system, by overreacting to events that really have no real value or play in our present time. So if you look here, our friend on the right, maybe you can relate to that. I certainly look like that at different times. You'll see this statement by Robert Sapolsky, who's a stress researcher. Stress-related disease occurs because we often activate a physiological system that is evolved for responding to acute physical emergencies. But we turn it on for months on end, endlessly worrying about mortgages and relationships and promotions. And so what happens is we take a system that was designed very efficiently to help us focus on threat, and now have driven it into a place that will now cause a breakdown of the body on so many levels. When you have the exaggeration of cortisol, it literally will dramatically increase fat deposition around the middle of your body. It will cause ongoing inflammation. It will damage the gut. It will compromise and reduce the function of the cells of the immune system. So all of that is happening under that stress-related situation. And that's why during your normal daily life, any form of activity that can help you deal with what we call stress response management may have a huge impact on being very profound for you. So what we're talking about here is, number one, engaging in some form of a simple meditative process. Now, what we know is that the most primal function of the human body is what we call breathing, obviously. And the way your breathing goes, so goes your emotion. That's why many systems of care, ancient systems like yoga and Tai Chi, they realize that that breathing process is the first way for us to have some input to kind of create some peace in body and mind. Because you cannot breathe in an anxious pattern of breathing and have a relaxed state of mind. And on the other hand, you can't breathe in a relaxed pattern of breathing and have an anxious state of mind. So the way you do and work your breathing can have a huge impact on how you create some stability of body and mind. And that's why one of the most fundamental stress management processes that people learn is how can you work naturally with your breathing process. It's the most primal function. It has the most impact on affecting the regulation of mood and behavior. And of course, it's not going to change the stressful event per se, but remember this and never forget this. For the most part, stress is not in the events of our lives. It is in the perception of those events. I have people who have the loss of children and they rally and come back and function. I have other people with a hangnail and can't get out of bed for a month. The way we relate and respond and perceive those events has so much to do with how we frame their impact on our lives. So reframing that will come out of this engagement where you can step back for some degree, even at 10 to 15 minutes a day. I would recommend it twice a day, but we already know that even 12 minutes a day of meditation will remarkably decrease aging, enhance the function of the immune system, and help you manage and respond to stress more successfully. We want to, again, participate in mindful movement practice. I recommend yoga, Tai Chi. I teach Tai Chi, have been practicing it for many, many years. But the practice of yoga and Tai Chi is another way to get into a more mindful approach, getting us into more present time awareness. We want to eliminate junk food, refined sugar, processed oils, alcohol, caffeine, and stimulants because these chemicals create a toxic stress that will again feed this adrenal cortisol response that can damage gut and again reduce the function of the immune system. We also know that an increase of physical activity at least 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times a week. We're recommending a minimum of about 150 minutes a week. And we've already seen the powerful impact of physical activity on the immune response. We want to secure adequate rest and sleep. We didn't spend a lot of time on sleep, but we know that as adults, we need at least 6 to 8 hours a night. And as you get older, I know sleep is a little harder, but we also know that people who exercise more readily sleep more successfully. People who get rid of stimulants, caffeine, nicotine, all the alcohol, all the refined foods will typically sleep better. But don't underestimate the impact of rest and sleep on the function and power of the immune system. One of the most powerful things that happens with sleep deficiency is that you get a remarkable increase in cortisol, driving that inflammatory response, damage to the gut, and once again, getting involved with the immune response, compromising it, exaggerating it, and reducing its efficiency when we have viral or bacterial infection. We want to increase sexual activity, intimacy as often as possible. I just throw that in because that's one of the best ways to deal with stress response. And finally, this is important, we want to laugh more and improve attitude. Interestingly enough, laughter and attitude have a huge impact on enhancing the function of the immune system. And so if you're going to stay cloistered in your house, if you're going to practice social distancing and you're going to watch TV, you may as well watch some good sitcoms and some good funny movies and just kind of laugh. You don't need the dour constant fear input that was really hoisted on us across time. So the bottom line here is understand that we have this incredible system, this immune system that is fluid, it's dynamic, it's changeable, it's working in an innate way, it's working in an adaptive way to be able to recognize and protect us, not only in present time, but ongoing, and then even to remember what it did. So it has a memory of how when we deal with something in the future, we can mount ourselves and protect ourselves even better. How the use of plant-based foods really reduces inflammation, enhances the function of that immune system. How components of that plant-based diet, especially things like vitamin D and antioxidants and all the phytonutrients, are playing a major role to have antiviral activity and really supporting the cells of the immune system. How getting our body weight lower and down by utilizing a plant-based approach remarkably reduces inflammation and enhances the body's ability to fight viral infection, to reduce upper respiratory infection, and how it can reduce the comorbid conditions of heart disease and high blood pressure and the like, and how important exercise is as an enhancer of immunity, and how important stress and how we handle it can go on. So if you really embrace these lifestyle factors and understand that you have the wisdom and intelligence within your body of this incredible dynamic system that can help you protect yourself against anything in this environment. So we don't have to live in fear, but by imposing these incredible conditions and getting sunlight and taking certain modest supplementation and eating whole food plant-based foods and engaging in ongoing physical activity and dealing with your own stress response and getting into more present time awareness, you are taking a giant step to providing the situation that gives you the maximum opportunity to have an immune system function at its greatest potential and capability, removing fear and helping you be the dynamic, powerful individual that you were born to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank Sabatino. I would say to everyone who's listening right now, if you want to go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reactions button, and you can press that and tell Dr. Sabatino what you thought of his presentation, or go in the chat box and scroll up to the up towards the top, and you'll see Frank Sabatino. Click on that, and down at the bottom where it says "to," you can send him a little note. If you had any question in your mind why we eat a whole food or follow a whole food plant-based lifestyle, it was answered in about 14 different ways tonight in terms of the message that Dr. Sabatino came across with. And if you are brand new, which I know a bunch of you are because we talked to you during our training sessions, to eating a whole food plant-based lifestyle, let there be no doubt in your mind the power and the impact. And it goes back to what Hippocrates said: let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And maybe Hippocrates should also have Frank Sabatino along with him in that line. We have a bunch of questions, but I'm only going to ask three in the interest of time. Here's a simple one. Dr. Sabatino, what do you think of the chances of the coronavirus picking up steam in the fall and winter months of this year?
Well, we made the point that, viruses do not like elevated temperature, not only in the body, but in the environment. So as the climate gets a little colder and as we get involved in our lifestyle, there may be another wave of this exposure. But I really want to emphasize to people that it's not fear that's going to be the solution to that, because the bottom line is we're inundated with viruses and bacteria on a constant state on a daily basis. And that's why I wanted to present this information, to realize that you do have tools that people are not addressing in ongoing lifestyle choices. And if you are an elder person with morbid conditions, there's no question that we want to make sure that you're not being compromised. But the key here is there probably will be some wave, because there always are additional waves of all flu and viral-like infections. I just don't want people to live in constant fear of this, and to understand the power that they have within themselves, especially by providing what we're doing. Get that fresh air, get out and get that sun exposure. Get into that plant-based approach. Get away from the junk foods. Get the rest and sleep that you need. Take a little additional supplementation. Vitamin D is powerful. A little bit of additional vitamin C and zinc may have some impact, depending on the studies you read. So it's not about a lot of supplementation, but it's about taking this very holistic view and understand that your immune system works like every other system in the body. It works in consort. And you saw from just the simple little descriptions that I gave how incredible that interaction and synergy really is. It goes so far beyond that. It's just mind-blowing to see the levels of control and feedback and the dynamic that's going on in this body for us to feel at fear because we don't have the equipment or the internal resources to handle things. This is just not the case.
Thank you very much. Can taking an elderberry supplement help your immune system? And if you think it should, how much should you take?
Yeah, elderberry has been shown to have some antiviral potential. The problem is most people are taking elderberry with these elderberry syrups and so on, and the sugar is only reducing the effectiveness of that. If you're going to do elderberry, you need to get real elderberry, the herb itself. And so you'd have to work with the elderberries or the herb, and you can take a small amount. But the truth is, if you're eating the panorama and diversity of foods that we're recommending, the full panorama of plant-based foods, all of the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, staying incredibly hydrated, resting, getting all of those antioxidant foods, high fiber diversity, you don't need to worry about elderberry. The only thing I would recommend is, as I said, I would definitely recommend adding that couple of thousand international units of vitamin D for people who are not getting sunlight. And if I did anything tonight, I made a strong case for sunlight and vitamin D as an immune enhancer.
Got an interesting question to that point.
Yes.
And actually, when you were talking about how important it was to get sunlight and to go out 10 to 15 minutes can be very, very important to the body. The question was, it was an observation. Is it because the people who live in the northern states have a higher COVID-19 instance than in southern states. Does that have something to do with the fact that there's more sunlight and there's more interest in being outside southern states?
Well, it was a combination of both the colder weather, the colder climate, and the engagement indoors, and again, the lack of sunlight. So I really feel that those are confounding factors. It's not the only thing, but based on what we saw, the idea, the ability where I live in Florida, the fact that I could be out working out an hour a day, half naked in soft sun, walking, doing my walks and getting air off the ocean. I mean, it makes such a difference, which is why many times there are seasonal affective disorders to viral infection. They're usually less in summers and warmer weather. They're worse in colder winter months. But the more you do the lifestyle choices we talked about, the more you'll even have protection during those times. That's why I even tell people that are not plant-based, I said, if you're not plant-based, at least go plant-based during the winter months. You'll have much less of an issue related to flus, viral infections, and things of that nature. So, it's just another way of looking at that. And yes, if you're going to live in those climates, I would definitely recommend taking vitamin D in supplemental form without any question.
Stress has been obviously a very, very key part of everyone's life in the last 2 to 3 months. And you covered it in a variety of different ways. But here's a simple question.
Yeah.
What is one simple technique that anyone can use to reduce their stress level that has proven effective over time?
Breathing. Following the breathing work. And what I mean by that is, if you're sitting or laying in a very quiet space, I mean literally just allowing yourself to breathe in and out and bringing your attention to breath. And what'll happen is there are many apps on phones that use like Yoga Nidra, which is a breathing technique, but the most direct line of support is breathing. So one of the things I will teach people is that if they're sitting in their chairs and they have their hands resting comfortably in their laps, imagine as you breathe that the breath is coming in through your nose only and taking an elevator ride down, keeping your hands on your belly. So when the breath comes down into your belly, your hands will move away from the body. And I slowly count to number 1 as I'm doing that. Then as I exhale, the belly will collapse, because breath, when you breathe in, the diaphragm is meant to drop. And so your lung fields get larger and breath can come in. So when the diaphragm drops, it's going to push your belly down and out. So a normal in-breath would show the belly moving outward. So in this process, you sit, hands on your belly comfortably, and as you breathe in, the belly will move out. You're counting the number 1, and then you exhale slowly, and the belly will collapse. You breathe in, now you're counting number 2 in your mind, and you're doing the same thing. By the time you get between 5 and 10, most anxieties in the moment are over. That's a very simple technique. But because breathing is so primal, and it's so easy to engage your own breath, it's one of the quickest ways to create mindfulness and to get rid of what the Buddhists like to call monkey mind. How we always have all of that stuff just kind of flitting about in our brains all the time. And many times when you go to sleep at night, you're still engaged with all that and you can't sleep effectively. So the bottom line is, I do a breathing type meditation every day, but you can breathe with a mantra, you can breathe by looking at something, you can breathe with visualization, you can make time to just sit and listen to the music of your choice gently. But take some time each day where you step back from the chatter of your lives. Now remember, with stress, there's 2 things. You can either change it situationally, the things you can change. It's like the serenity prayer. You change the things that you can. If you can't change it, then you have to change your relationship to it. That's what we call reframing. So the combination of simple breath meditation and then delaying your responses to the events that trigger you and seeing if there's some way you can reframe the perspective of what you're experiencing are 2 simple things that we can all engage in. And I think that's something that would be at least some basic tools.
Dr. Sabatino, you are a remarkable presenter. And I think I speak for everyone in the Eat Smart, Live Longer Club. We are so much better off for having you here tonight than when this day began, with everything that we've been going through.
And Ross, let me say one thing. On my website, drfranksabatino.com, this issue of obesity and weight gain is such an important thing for me that I created a 13-module program called Lean for Life. It was moderated by Chef AJ. and I created all the content, and it's 13 modules. It's available on the homepage of drfranksabatino.com. And anybody out there that's suffering with weight issues and want to understand all of the pieces involved, including addiction and stress and all the hormonal relationships that we briefly alluded to, on that homepage of drfranksabatino.com, that is available at a very modest price, and it's a remarkable 13-module program. And I urge you to direct anybody that's suffering with that problem to go there to get that.
That will be a part of our next newsletter. Thank you again, and thank you to everybody for sharing your evening with us.
And I want to thank everybody. I want to thank everybody myself, and it was such a pleasure, and I hope this came across okay. It's such a new format for all of us.
Thank you again. Just click the leave button, everybody, and you will disappear from the Zoom session. Thank you again, everybody.